Well, hello. My name is Dr. Stephen Morse. I'm the founder and CEO of Unchained Solutions. We are a consulting firm based in Sydney, and we work with Australian organisations to help them to implement the Australian Modern Slavery Act and also now the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act. We are a social enterprise in the sense that we give a portion of our profits, to organisations that work directly with survivors. So we're a survivor-focused organisation. And the purpose of today's presentation is to help you to understand better the issue of modern slavery and the impact of this human rights violation on business and the community. And I'm also going to put forward a way for you to think about how you can become a more conscious consumer and think about how you are contributing and how you can actually contribute to making an impact on the issue of modern slavery. So just as a run through today in terms of the agenda, we're going to think a little bit first about defining modern slavery and then the impact of slavery and what it looks like around the world. We'll delve into look at a high level view of the Modern Slavery Act and what's actually required for Australian organisations to actually deal with this issue. A little bit about Unchained and the work that we do before then moving into some of the research that we've been doing to assess the corporate response. And then I'm going to posit what I see as the future of compliance before circling back to helping you think through how you can become a much more conscious consumer and make an impact for yourself. So first up, defining modern slavery. Well, modern slavery is the commodification of people for the purpose of exploitation and financial gain. And we learned this is from Unseen UK. So when we think about how to define modern slavery, we're thinking about something which is very commercial in nature. People are using other people to profit from them and putting them in all sorts of different employment and suffering all sorts of privations in order to make a profit for them. There are different ways that we can look at a definition of modern slavery from a human rights approach, if you like. Slavery in its essence is really the forced removal or the loss of choice, voice, and movement. So people are restricted in where they can go. They're restricted in terms of what they can say and what they can do with their lives. And that's kind of the essence of what slavery is, and there's a fair degree of ownership attached to that. When we think about modern slavery from a legislative point of view, and in particular the Modern Slavery Act, both in the United Kingdom and also in Australia, which actually use this term, we're looking at more of an umbrella term to describe a range of human rights violations of a particular theme, of a particular nature, and also with a commercial aspect to them, something transactional. So this is, we've got forced labor, forced servitude, debt bondage, child labor or extreme forms of child labor, forced marriage and human trafficking. And this is the rubric, if you like, of what comes under the umbrella, especially of the Modern Slavery Act. Although this is not an exclusive list, we could add to this list. We could think about issues around sex trafficking, for example, child soldiering, it would be another one. But for the definition of the Australian Modern Slavery Act, these 6 plus slavery come under the definition of modern slavery. So how do we arrive then at thinking through, well, who is in slavery? Who is impacted? Well, it's very difficult to work out, and this adds to, there's a certain complexity around the issue of modern slavery. So what we can decide is, well, what are the indicators of modern slavery? So for example, we might think about low pay or no pay, people who are on very low wages or not being paid at all. We can think about their employment conditions, their contracts. So what are the hours? Are they working, perhaps 18 hours a day for several days at a time, with time off completely compromised, and they're worked nonstop. We're looking at recruitment fees. There are cases where people might need to pay money to get a job. So in order to, especially if they're going to cross a boundary into another country, they might need to pay a recruiter, say up to $5,000 in order to get the job. And that, in a sense, can lead to the risk of needing to borrow money, which can lead to debt bondage. We're looking at contracts which are not there or they're not legal. And so there's a compromised contractual arrangement. The loss of identity is often present. People's passports, their papers, their identities taken from them. There are fines, often fines for non-compliance. There are fines for breaking things. There are fines for terminating an agreement. And another way, a very common way, we can look at the situation of a factory and what are the conditions. What is the quality of air, water, what happens to waste, what is the safety around machinery. And then there are lots of psychological and physical threats and violence and intimidation, sexual violence, abuse, verbal abuse. So all these are indicators. Now, I think the more indicators we have clustered together, then we're looking more like it's a definition of modern slavery, because each of these indicators on their own don't necessarily mean that a person is in slavery. So the more clusters, the greater the concentration of indicators, the more it is the case that this person is suffering some form of modern slavery risk. In terms of the scope, we don't really know how many people are in slavery. And this figure, 40 million people, has been around for several years now. So we're looking at in excess of 40 million people in slavery. And it's a number that's growing every day. 1 in 4 people in slavery are children, and 73% are women and girls. So we're looking at a very huge gender imbalance when it comes to modern slavery risk. 2/3 are in forced labor. So the largest group of have to do with people that are working in factories. They're working on farms. They're working on fishing boats, making and producing and harvesting and packaging all the goods and services that we enjoy here in Australia, for example. We're looking at an industry that is in excess of $150 billion US. And an industry that is very much controlled by organized crime, the mafia, lots of money laundering, all sorts of issues around transactions and money and fraudulent behavior. Now, for many people, it's surprisingly modern slavery also exists in Australia. And so it was actually way back in 2018 that the Global Slavery Index put forward around 15,000 cases of modern slavery, although I think this is a very conservative figure considering some of the dynamics that occur here in Australia. Most of the evidence in Australia to date is quite anecdotal. We know that slavery exists in many sectors, and we also know that there are many people at risk, particularly asylum seekers, those who are coming, say, from the Pacific region as seasonal workers. There are lots of behaviors and situations where people are actually exploited. And that leads to probably the third real definition of modern slavery is that it does exist on a continuum. I think one of the surprising things and things that we need to think about in terms of Australia is that only 1 in 5 cases are reported. And so that begs the question is, well, what about the other 4? How is it that in a country like Australia, only 1 in 5 cases of modern slavery are reported, and what is happening to the other 4 cases? So coming back to this is a quote from Nolan and Bersma back in 2019, that modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should not and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage, reduce, and eliminate modern slavery, we need to first acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges. We should treat the symptoms and the causes. So modern slavery is a very grey area. There's a lot of complexity. It's an issue that's at times it's dubbed as being hidden in plain sight. And it takes a lot of work, a lot of investment to actually understand the real issues. What are the push and pull factors, the contextual issues that are actually driving this, and how can we address those issues in order to prevent this issue alongside prosecution and protecting those and standing with those who actually have been impacted. So that's our definition of modern slavery. So what's the impact of modern slavery in the world? Well, you probably are aware that modern slavery exists in many industries, and some of those industries are very well known, particularly in the high consumables. So it's been known for a long time. There are issues in the production of chocolate, in cocoa, for example, in plantations in parts of West Africa. We know that there's lots of issues around fast fashion in the fashion industry, which has a very long and complex supply chain and many touch points in the production of fabrics, from the harvesting of cotton to the threading, the weaving, the dyeing process, the inputs, the making of the actual fabric into the garments, and the distribution of those garments. There are lots of touch points where people are actually exploited, all the way from Central Asia, South Asia, and then into East Asia itself. Of recent years, there's been some attention given to, a spotlight given to what's going on Thai fishing boats. And some great work has been done, particularly by a company, one of the largest companies in Thailand, Thai Union, to address issues where young men especially are being trapped at sea for months, if not years at a time, and just going from boat to boat until they're completely exhausted and weak and too weak and sick to actually work anymore, in which they're then simply thrown overboard. So these are big issues that are occurring simply from the products that we enjoy at different times of the year, and some of them we enjoy every day. Other areas of risk, we've mentioned this, obviously, there's primary industries such as agriculture, fisheries, logging and mining. There's issues in retail services, cleaning and security. Fashion has been noted. The construction industry, which is a big area where we do a lot of work at Unchained. There's issues to do both in the production of construction materials that are being sourced from East Asia, and in the actual construction sites themselves. And there's lots of issues around, in terms of workers being trapped, not necessarily in Australia, but in different parts of the world into the construction industry. Medical equipment, food production, logistics, transport, IT, and hospitality. So you think of an industry, there will be some touch point with modern slavery risk of various degrees that we can think of. One of the big incidents that brought the issue of modern slavery to light in our world was way back in 2013 in Dhaka, Bangladesh, when the Rana Plaza collapsed. This was a factory, a garment factory, and in the lead up to this building's collapse, the women who had been working, most of them were women working in this building at their sewing stations, had actually noted that there were cracks in the walls, and these cracks were getting bigger and bigger. And although they had complained and brought the attention of this to the factory owners, nothing was done. And on the morning of the building's collapse, the women actually who were working there then decided that this building is completely unsafe. We need to get out, and they were forced back into the building, upon which they were collapsed, and up to just over 1,100 women were killed that day. And this incident really brought internationally the attention from the media and some of the big fashion labels around what is going on in parts of Bangladesh and Cambodia and Vietnam and India, in terms of the way in which workers, people, rights holders, if you like, are being treated. And so this issue brought to light many of the issues and has put a stamp, if you like, in terms of what companies need to be doing to address modern slavery risks in their supply chains. Coming back to Australia, we know that there's anecdotal evidence, but around different types of risks. One of the biggest areas of risk in Australia has to do with forced marriage. There are at least 4,000 cases of forced marriage in Australia every year. And it's a big issue that's currently being looked at by human rights groups and NGOs to actually work with those who are impacted and affected by forced marriage, whether or not they were married, people were married overseas, or they were married while they're here and then kept in a state of servitude within that domestic environment, or being forced to marry against their will. As I mentioned, construction is an issue here, and a couple of years ago there was a report of a group of men who were brought, I think, from South Asia into Australia to actually work on a construction site, and this was just outside outside Canberra, and they were all taken to live on a property where they actually had no rights. They were paid about $250 a week, but in essence worked at least 6, if not 7 days on a construction site, and had to pay out of that $250 that they earned, they paid about $100 in rent, and then had to spend their day off actually working on the farm itself. So here we have a situation where people are, in Australia, it's very easy for people to be isolated in this vast continent, and particularly if they don't speak the language, they don't know what their rights are, they can be easily trapped in situations of modern slavery. So these are the areas where there's big concern for Australia. The cleaning industry, particularly in corporate buildings, the Cleaning Accountability Framework is doing a lot in this space. So there are lots of different NGOs and organisations at work to address these issues alongside Fair Work, the Australian Border Force, the Australian Federal Police. But more work needs to be done in terms of understanding the nature of these risks and building upon a bigger understanding of how do we actually mitigate these risks and assist those who are actually impacted in this country. There's been an impact of modern slavery has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is unfortunately ongoing for us. But often in Australia, it was noted that whilst people were, dealing with the loss of products on their shelves, and there was many unfortunate incidences of people fighting over, for example, toilet rolls. This is probably, the COVID-19 really has brought to light how and where our products come from. And so whilst we, in a sense, we're in a sense in a position where we were questioning, okay, well, where do our products come from? Which was actually a good thing for us to actually start thinking about, that our products don't just appear magically on our shelves, that they do come from somewhere. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really heightened the complexities and the dynamics around the global supply chain and the disruption. And that disruption is ongoing and has had a very big impact on many parts of our world. A story that came really right out of the early days of the pandemic back in 2020 was the impact of COVID-19 on rights holders in the garment industry. Way back in March and April 2020, up to $3 billion worth of orders were either cancelled or suspended overnight. And this had a really big impact on many factories. This is a story that I have here of a factory in Bangladesh, where that was basically what the workers were just told, that's it, there's no more orders, you don't have a job. And there was the story of a woman called Fatima who had a young boy, and she was basically talked about her situation where she was just tapped on her shoulder, told to leave her station, and was put at risk in light of that. So it wasn't that in the sense that she was in a situation of modern slavery in that factory, but simply by losing her job, she was put at risk of being exploited simply because she would then be needing to either borrow money in order to sustain her life or send out her child in order to work at a lower rate. So the impact, whilst in Australia, we may have done without everything we wanted to get from the shop, and we may have needed to rely on the government for handouts from time to time. In places like Bangladesh and Cambodia, where they didn't have those kinds of protections and safety net, people were put at risk of modern slavery. Back in Australia, there was a big impact on international students, and there was a report put out jointly by the University of Technology Sydney and UNSW to look at the impact of COVID-19 on international students during, particularly around, this also dates back to 2020, although I know that some more work has been done on this. But some research was done to understand some of the issues on international students. 70% of whom experienced job loss, 32% were unable to pay for the essentials, 42% were fearful of homelessness, and of them 14% actually experienced homelessness. So not many, in terms of international students, their situation was impacted in the sense that they at times were unable to go back to their country of origin. They didn't receive any JobKeeper payments. They weren't entitled to them. And yeah, they were also at risk of having to suffer lower pay and insecure contracts and pay conditions, and also the issues of homelessness as well. And yeah, also many of them, 29%, said they were fearful of visa implications. And so we have a dynamic here in Australia, which is not over, and a dynamic that's going on in the world, in which COVID-19 has, in a sense, heightened our sensitivities and our awareness to supply chain disruption, the impact on different communities in our country, and we need to appreciate that these issues have not just disappeared, that they're ongoing, despite the fact that things have progressed and we've moved on a little bit more in Australia. But globally, the impact of COVID-19 continues, and its impact on people's employment situation continues. So moving on then from the definition of modern slavery and the impact, how do we make sense then of the Modern Slavery Act in terms of what it is seeking to achieve? Well, the Modern Slavery Act 2018 is a Commonwealth legislation, and it really brought in a new area of compliance to the business community in Australia. It was effective from January 2019, and it calls upon Australian organisations to report on the risk of modern slavery in their supply chains and operations. The Modern Slavery Act is part of a global movement and the emergence of legislation, hard legislation, to respond to the softer legislation that has been articulated, particularly in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Business and Human Rights Guiding Principles. And so we've taken, the United Nations has put out their soft legislation, which encouraging government and business to take steps, strong steps, to address a whole range of human rights and sustainability issues, and to really work towards a culture change in the way that we do business in the world. And it's out of that the Modern Slavery Act emerged, built broadly on similar legislation in the United Kingdom back in 2015. There are other legislation in the world. There's a California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. And in France, Netherlands, there are also legislation, which some of the strongest legislation is there in France to actually ensure that companies actually do the due diligence and report on the effectiveness of that due diligence. There is a legislation currently emerging in New Zealand and in Canada, and in other parts, the European Union as a whole. So we have this emergence of hard law to work with organizations, work with companies to actually take seriously the risk of slavery in their supply chains and operations. So what are some of the distinctives of the Modern Slavery Act? Well, it calls upon organizations to identify the risks through an annual reporting mechanism. So year on, year in, companies need to actually describe what they've discovered through their activities, and also then describe how they're going to what they're going to do in response to what they've discovered. So there's a dynamic here of year-on improvement. Hopefully, that's the idea, that as companies report 1 year on, then they come back and they report on the effectiveness of what the actions they've taken, in order to then put in some to either tweak or change or strengthen the actions that they've already taken. Companies have 6 months to report on the financial year, and that financial will vary from entity to entity. Most Australian entities will report from a reporting period of July 1 to June 30, which is the normal financial year. But many universities, for example, have a calendar financial year, so it'll be January to December. Other financial years are also in there, depending on whether or not an entity is part of a larger group that's based in the United Kingdom or the United States or Japan or other European or a country in Europe. So the Modern Slavery Act applies to all commercial entities with an annual consolidated revenue of more than 100 million, with the option for smaller entities to voluntarily opt in to comply and to be treated as such as a reporting entity. what many of the leaders in the world are wanting companies to think about is that it's not when they're approaching modern slavery risk, it's not just a question of if, but really where and to what extent there is slavery in your supply chains and operations. So as companies do this, they need to actually expect to find something. That's the idea. It's not a question of doing as little as possible in order to meet compliance and tick a box. Rather, companies are being encouraged, particularly from the softer legislation, to actually do whatever it takes. If you scratch enough, you will find something. And so that is something that companies need to take into account as they set goals and objectives for the work that they're doing. So simply, the government issues the legislation, and there are two key words for organizations or companies. One is transparency. They need to be transparent about what's going on and to record that. And there are risks involved in that for companies to be transparent about what's going on in their supply chains and to know what they need to know. And then the second part, which I think is actually a little bit harder, is to take responsibility, to put in systems and procedures and strategies to actually make an impact. And this cannot be resolved overnight. This cannot be done in a week. This is a slow burn process that's going to take many years for companies. And a very good example of that would be Nestle, who, and in terms of the work that they've been doing in Ivory Coast, for example, to work with farmers who produce cocoa beans. They have been working in this part of the world for more than 10 years, maybe more than 15 years, to actually work and understand the issues, the real issues that are affecting these farmers and their families, and all the key stakeholders, all the key players, all those who are working in the development of chocolate, the manufacturing of chocolate, to cut through and make sure that whatever they implement has real meaning and impact for the farmers and their families. And so this process has been going on for several years, and it cannot be resolved overnight. So on the one hand, there's a great temptation to be critical of some big companies because they might be perceived as not doing enough. And there's a role for civil society and government to keep an eye on companies, but there's also a sense in which a lot of the work that companies need to do is going to take them a long time, and it's going to take a lot of investment over several reporting periods, and something to keep in mind. So we want to encourage companies in that sense. So in terms of summary, so it applies to entities with over 100 million, but of course, small entities can also comply, and Unchained, we work with a range of entities, including those who are under that threshold. It applies to all commercial entities, but also not-for-profits. So if you're a big charity, for example, and you have huge revenues, then you also need to report in. And we're seeing that, say, for example, the Salvation Army and World Vision also provide reports. Non-reporting entities may opt in, and entities need to report to the Australian Border Force, and you can go check out their website. There's a register called the Modern Slavery Register, and you can actually go and see for yourself and read all the reports. Over 4,000 reports are now registered there, and you can actually see for yourself what companies are actually doing, both in the previous financial year and the first financial year. So many companies are now up to their third modern slavery statement. At present, there are no fines for non-compliance or misleading information, but the Department of Home Affairs, the Minister for Home Affairs, has the right to name and shame. That's not really what they want to do. They want to name and fame to actually champion those organisations that are doing the right thing, and in a sense to promote and stimulate a race to the top rather than a race to the middle. At present, the Modern Slavery Act is in a process of review, and we're all waiting for a paper to be circulated in order for different organisations such as Unchained to actually review some of the proposals to change this legislation, to strengthen it. And there are many ways, many suggestions in which this legislation can be changed. There's always the question around whether or not we need to put in some sort of fine for non-compliance, whether or not we need to lower the threshold, whether or not, but I suppose more importantly, for the government to articulate much more strongly what is due diligence, what does it look like, Where should companies be up to at the moment? And how can the government be supporting industry in understanding where the key risks are and how to address those risks more effectively? So I think there's a lot more work that could be done in terms of collaboration between government and industry. The modern slavery statements are required to follow a structure. And so you can also see in the guidance for reporting entities, it's the document put out by the Commonwealth, the types of activities and actions that companies need to do in order to report effectively and comply with the law. I won't go through this in detail at the moment, but I just refer that to you. Actually, the best way to actually understand the Modern Slavery Act is to actually read the guidance for reporting entities rather than the legislation itself, because this actually describes what it is that companies need to do. Most of the activities here have to come in criteria 4, 3, 4, and 5, where companies actually describe the risks. So they need to do processes and activities to describe modern slavery risk, both in their supply chains and in their operations. And then they need to, in point 4, need to describe the actions that they've taken to address those risks for effective monitoring and reporting. And fifthly, in the 5th criteria then, is to describe how effective that those processes are. And this area for many companies is one of the most challenging. It's all very well to do a certain number of processes, but the challenge with the modern slavery legislation is to actually demonstrate how effective those are, and it's early days at this stage in terms of companies actually doing that effectively and actually seeing that what they're doing actually is having the desired impact that they're putting money and resources and people into. This is a model, a sample or a mock strategy or framework that companies and entities can take, and we work with organizations in a number of ways with different levels of maturity. So you could break it down, the reporting, into different stages: stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And here you could then think through what are the kinds of activities that companies need to do in different stages. So we recommend, for example, in stage 1, that organizations actually set up the right governance framework. So they might have an existing governance framework, depending on the size and the expertise in the organization, or they actually need to develop one. And by extension, then this governance framework will apply to all sorts of different policies and issues that they're actually looking to monitor and report on. The second step would be then to do a bit of a deep dive, do a bit of an analysis into, well, how ready is a company to actually comply with the legislation? What do they already have in place? There's no point reinventing the wheel when it comes to addressing modern slavery risks. If there are mechanisms and frameworks already in place, how can they be adapted? How can they be enlarged or edited or strengthened to actually address this issue? Some of the other activities in there would be to look at your policies as a whole. So what policies do you already have in place in your policy suite? How many of those, and to what extent would they actually deal with effectively modern slavery risks, and what kind of inputs do we need to put in place? The initial risk assessment is really about mapping the entire supply chain, which comes through looking at all the procurement spend data and putting that into organizing that into categories, procurement categories, with a view to then looking at where the risks are by country and industry, to get a picture, a heat map, if you like, of where the risks lie in the direct suppliers, who are probably mainly in Australia. And the 5th part of the first stage would be really around an awareness piece. So to bring widespread, enterprise-wide training around the why, basically similar to what I'm doing here today. What is modern slavery? What does the Modern Slavery Act require? And what do we need to do as a company or as an organization? So that really would be stage 1, about getting companies set up on the right framework, on the right footing. From there, they can actually then start going deeper through the process. So once they've got, for example, that initial risk assessment in stage 2, then they can start actually engaging with suppliers, considering a supplier code of conduct, looking at seeing what companies have to say for themselves through a self-assessment questionnaire, thinking through what other resources are there available for us to actually understand risk beyond an engagement with our suppliers. Having reviewed the policies, they might then want to set up a structure to develop some policies. They might have a WHS policy, they might have a HR policy, but they don't really have a procurement policy. They don't have a human rights policy. They don't have a whistleblower policy. So there's all sorts of policies that they can put in place, along with a framework and a structure to actually socialize those policies within the organization. And then having done some initial awareness training, what are some skills-based training that needs to be rolled out for those who are engaged specifically with the suppliers? So how they can then best interpret self-assessment questionnaires, how can they best understand a code of conduct, how can they work better with their suppliers. Moving into stage 3, then we can see that from there you might need to, in terms of the risk assessment, to do more vertical mapping. And that means actually taking a particular product and actually tracing, going down through the supply chain to trace beyond the first tier of suppliers to understand more of where the real risks are, and where you can actually identify issues of modern slavery, but also issues of quality and efficiency, and where you might be perhaps losing money because of all the actors involved in the development of that product. So and also part of that is identifying where the real risks are and what you can actually do to remedy those risks. Some work can be done around measuring effectiveness. So once you've done all these processes, you now have some data, you have some outputs. Okay, how can we actually then start thinking around the goals and the metrics and the outcomes that you want to have for ongoing improvement. And as you can see, it goes further and further through. So there's lots of activity, lots of work that companies need to do to set some really good goals and objectives, and to make sure they have the right resources, the right investment to address modern slavery risk. And for those who are not convinced about this legislation, although they should be, because the legislation there, we can also make some recommendations around the business case. And it's very important for particularly people in finance to understand, well, there is the legislative requirements, but what are some of the what's the actual business case for this? And there's a lot to be said for making sure that addressing modern slavery risk is not just a problem space, but it's not just a cost space, but it can be a profit center as well. That as companies do the due diligence, not just on modern slavery, but other human rights violations, in addition to that, the environmental considerations, they can also start thinking through how this will then change and affect their position in the market. So there's a case for being competitive in the market in an emerging ESG reporting world. There's issues around reputational risk. And whilst we don't advocate that specifically, because the Modern Slavery Act is about addressing risks to those people working in different environments, there is a case for reputational risk. That is, you address these issues, you will strengthen your reputation. There are ways that you can then mitigate financial and legal risks as well, as increased transparency brings about legal ramifications for organizations. And also too, there's in a work environment where purpose is increasingly important, there's ways to actually engage staff and particularly younger workers who are looking for purpose in their work. And we know that there are lots of costs attributed to staff retention or the lack of, and the investment required to invest in employing people. If we can actually retain staff and keep them stimulated because we're actually doing something beyond ourselves, that's a good way of also reducing costs as well and motivating staff. And we've seen some great examples of that. Organizations who have actually engaged their staff beyond awareness to actually think through, okay, how can we've got a portion of our team who are directly responsible for addressing modern slavery risk, but we also have other people in the organization who have interest in perhaps partnering with NGOs, with charities, with other groups on the ground, and channeling their energies and their interests around advocacy and fundraising and volunteering and supporting communities of people who aren't necessarily part of the supply chain. But addressing modern slavery risk is not just about supply chain due diligence. There's a whole broader context in which people can get involved. And so as companies can actually engage their staff in getting involved in CSR activities, it actually adds value to their entire modern slavery risk management framework. So then a little bit about Unchained and who we are and what we do. We inspire Australian organisations to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery. And as a consultancy, we really want to work with companies, first of all, to comply with the Modern Slavery Act and implement that in their supply chains and organisations, but also then to see this as a great vehicle to actually go beyond just compliance, but to look for opportunities for greater impact. And as mentioned earlier, we give a portion of our profits to other organisations that are working directly with survivors, because we're based in Sydney in a very affluent area. We don't have a direct contact with those who are at risk. Our commitment to the space is to support those who do actually work directly with people at risk of modern slavery. Unchained is a blend of those who have lived experience. So we have people on team who have actually worked with survivors in different parts of the world, and we've combined that with our knowledge of tools and expertise to actually work with companies to address issues of risk, to analyze that risk, and to actually work with their policies and help them to strengthen their engagement with modern slavery risk, but also with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our area of service or solutions covers five solution types. We have training products, we have analytical tools and processes. We do a lot of work around strategy, and we do a lot of work around reporting and helping companies to report effectively. And fifthly, we also do a lot of work around research, and part of that research is to engage the corporate response to the Modern Slavery Act. So if you want to know, I won't touch any more about Unchained, but if you'd like to talk with me further about what we do and how we help organisations, you're most welcome to reach out to me, and I'll have my contact details at the end. But what I just wanted to I know we're low on time, but I just wanted to really think about that piece around the research that we do. So we currently have a PhD research partnership with Monash University, and they have loaned a PhD student to us to help us in our research, which in turn is helping them with their research as part of the Macquarie Business School. And in this process, then we are actually reviewing modern slavery statements, but we're also conducting interviews with corporates, with business leaders, to help them to understand some of the gaps and the opportunities that they've encountered as they've actually done this due diligence work. So it's a two-step research piece, which is very exciting. When we assess where companies are at in terms of their modern slavery approach to modern slavery, there's been some reports put out from different organisations, including Monash, to assess the corporate response. And as you can see, there's different types of organisations have been reviewed in terms of their statements and different approaches. We've currently, at Unchained, with Macquarie University, researched around 135 statements over the past 2 years. And some of the themes, some of the ways that basically there's agreement among the four reports that the four areas of research, really, some of those key themes that have come out, some of them have to do with a lack of supplier risk assessment beyond direct suppliers. So many companies have successfully or in various degrees been able to map their supply chain, categorize their suppliers to different categories, and overlay that with different risk indicators to get a heat map of where the risks are. But one of the challenges that they've had, ongoing challenges, is to actually go beyond that, to go beyond direct suppliers and then collaborate and incentivize and build the capacity among their direct suppliers to understand those risks beyond supply chain, particularly those risks beyond our shores, which is where those suppliers are procuring products and services. So in addition to that, then there's been a lack of stakeholder engagement for capacity building. So that one of the tensions of the Modern Slavery Act is that companies have just, for example, issued an SAQ, a self-assessment questionnaire, and then taken at face value the information they've received from suppliers without actually necessarily engaging suppliers constructively to incentivize them to actually go beyond and do the risks themselves and collaborate with them to actually identify where the risks are beyond the supply chain. And there's lots of issues around that in terms of capacity. A third thing would be a lack of clear remediation. So if a company does identify a case, what is their approach to remedy? How are they going to remediate? And part of that has to do with not doing enough contextual research and stakeholder engagement to actually understand where the risks are. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, then there's an issue around a lack of clear metrics and indicators to measure the effectiveness. So companies are doing lots of activities, lots of processes, but not actually doing enough to understand how effective those processes are. So that's, in a sense, a very high-level snapshot of the kind of research that's been done on the corporate response and some of the key themes that are emerging at this time. So then when it comes to addressing modern slavery risks, some of the things that we do that I do see that companies need to do is to go beyond process. A lot of companies are relying on data, particularly received data that have come through a lot of credible lists, so put out by the ILO, International Labour Organization, put out by the Global Slavery Index, for example. So there's lots of credible data, but unfortunately some of that data may be historic and may be general in nature. So it's not enough for an organization to say, well, here are our suppliers and here are the particular industries that they work in, and then to grab the data from the Global Slavery Index to say, yeah, well, this is our risk assessment. Unfortunately, whilst there's the great work being done and it's a great report and a necessary report from the Global Slavery Index, companies actually need to do the process themselves to actually understand the risk and to go beyond that data to get the specifics of risk. The data doesn't actually give us enough visibility, doesn't present enough traceability or transparency. We actually need to take the data as a baseline and go beyond process. And that will involve doing a lot more around stakeholders, which I identified earlier. So working with suppliers, trying to actually close the gap between suppliers and their suppliers and those who are actually working in different contexts in factories, on farms, on boats. So it's about closing the gap, bridging the gap, and to get a better understanding of actually what's going on. And there's been obviously some difficulties around that, around restrictions with travel. So it's not been easy to get that level of visibility, particularly over the last couple of years. But now that the world is opening up again, it's very important that companies need to go beyond compliance, go beyond process to actually get the specifics. And coming back to that quote from Nolan and Bersma, to actually understand the context within which modern slavery exists. A third area that I think companies need to also consider is around positive leverage. So as mentioned earlier, this modern slavery risk is not just a modern slavery space. It's not just a problem space, it's also an opportunity space. And so companies need to think around the actual ecosystem within which they operate, think through in terms of their entire value chain, where they could actually leverage in the space, and to not think, well, we're just going to minimize modern slavery risk when actually that's not actually achievable for them, to actually look, where can we collaborate, where can we partner, where can we invest, who can we work with, what is the work that we can do and what can we achieve to contribute to a broader point of collaboration across sectors, government, business, and NGO, for example. And I think as companies do that, then they'll be able to explore the context of worker exploitation to actually really understand the specifics in a particular context. They'll be able to take a stronger stakeholder-based approach to risk, that it's not just something that is ethereal, something that's theoretical in some tower in a big city, but actually they've actually gone out onto the field in conjunction and collaboration with NGOs to actually determine what are the real risks and how can we approach those risks, and in turn, what are the remedies? What is actually going to be meaningful to people on a factory in the middle of Bangladesh, for example, not something we think about as which may be meaningful to them, but something which is actually meaningful to them that we can actually do something about, which actually may not be as scary as we once thought. So then finally, in closing, coming back to you, I'd like you to think about your response. What I've put forward today might seem huge. First of all, the complexities of modern slavery and all the nuances, which makes for a very big, scary monster in a sense with modern slavery risk. And also too, there's a lot of work and things for organizations to think about. But there's also things that we can do as individuals, as individuals consumers. Not that I like to think of people as consumers, but the market treats us many ways as consumers. So, many ways to be or to be part of a society is to consume, and we're constantly being asked to consume. So how can we do that in a conscious way, in a responsible way today? And I want to leave you with that. Here, I'm just articulated 7 practical steps for you to consider to be a more conscious consumer. The first is, and I'm sure you're very good at this as university students, is to question everything. So question is, when you come to a product, you might like to ask yourself, do I really need this product? Why do I think I need it? Who is making this product? Being mindful of what goes into products, although it can be quite a full-time job at times, will actually go a long way to helping you to be much more conscious and responsible. And then reflecting then on what you buy, to think about maybe some more ethical brands. There are lots of different apps and trusted sources these days, and they're emerging. How can we actually think through the brands and what they're saying about themselves, and how do we, and really reflecting on what they are and the impact of what they're doing, and is it actually meaningful? And part of that is also being kind. There's the level of kindness there, because not every brand can address every issue all at once. And so you might find there's brands and that they might say be taking they might be recycling or repurposing fabrics from another brand. That's great. Tick. They're doing that. They're taking products. They're taking fabric from another company that doesn't need them. They're just going to be discarded and chucked. So they're going to repurpose that. And at the same time, then they're doing a lot to work with low-skilled people who maybe from a background that's where they don't have the same kind of privileges. And so they're working with a community of people to help them to upskill and to educate. So great tick. They're working with underserved communities. There's 2 big ticks there, and we need to be supporting that kind of organization. What they haven't been able to do, though, is that they can't actually determine from the fabrics that they're purchasing from another label how those fabrics are going to be made. And in one sense, that's unfortunate, but they're doing 2 things, and I think they're worthy to be supported, because we can't solve all these issues all at once. We need to have a change of mindset. We need to think through what it is and how we want to live our lives, and the kind of things that we think we need to live a good life in Australia. And we overconsume in Australia. I'm guilty of that. We expect everything to be on our shelves, and which is why we didn't cope at times during COVID with the lack of toilet rolls and tissues and eggs and whatever was missing from our shelves. But we do need to think through what it is that we do think we need in order to live. We need to look at trusted resources. We need to educate ourselves. We also need to repurpose and recycle. So how long do we actually wear clothes for? Do we actually need fast fashion, that's where most of the high risks are in the fashion industry? Do we need to just wear something once? Can we actually wear it perhaps for a longer time than we think that it's worth? And finally, then, to be the change. To contribute to a growing and emerging movement of people and organizations who are wanting to do things differently, to live in a different way, and to be the change that you want to see. I'm going to leave you finally with a quote from Richard Branson, who says, "There's never been a more exciting time for all of us to explore this next great frontier where the boundaries between work and high purpose are merging into one, and we're doing good. It really is good for business. We do live in an age where we do have an opportunity. We have this knowledge, we have the skills, we have the technology to affect change. At times there is a lack of energy for that, and particularly in times of global disruption. And I mean, I can list them all. They're all the excuses that I've received from companies for decision fatigue coming out of COVID lockdowns. We've had flooding in the eastern parts of Australia. We've had ongoing supply chain disruption, the impact of China and its relationship to Australia, war in Ukraine, rising inflation, rising interest rates, the Great Resignation. There's always going to be issues before us. And so in these times, there is a need to forge ahead to make an impact, not just in modern slavery, which is my area, but also in other areas, other human rights violations, reconciliation, gender inequality, diversity, environment. There's lots of things that we can do to make a difference and contribute to a better world for all. So thank you. So I just want to leave you with that. If you want to connect with me, you can scan my QR code there, and that takes you to all my socials. Some key takeaways for today really is to understand the complexities of modern slavery, and there's a lot of general information, but to really work hard to get to the specifics. Some of the key takeaways for companies and business really is to go beyond process and to go deeper in their investigations and to make that investment. And then I think for us as individuals to be the change that we want to be in the world that we are expecting to create.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I had two things I guess I wanted to ask you about, if we can have a quick chat. And the first is about definitions, because I know that this is quite a contentious area, and particularly among academics it is. And I noted that on your slide where you talked about the legislation, you had those 6 elements, but then you added a couple more. So yes. I think it's the Australian government definition, which has the 6 elements, and you said, well, actually, and there's also
there are other areas.
Yeah. So how do you work with definitions, and is it contentious in NGOs and in business also?
Oh, I think your definitions are contentious, and it's I think probably one of the tensions at the moment, particularly when those 6 categories, and we could just add the 7th because that's what the Commonwealth has. They have 7, which is just slavery, which has more to do with ownership. Really is then clearly articulating and defining what that means. What is the difference between domestic servitude and forced labor, for example? What is the difference between why is forced marriage in the definition, but not, for example, forced sex work, which I know, which was, there are issues in the sex industry, for example, in Australia, but I also am aware that if in the consultation process, if NGOs, for example, who are concerned about issues around exploitation and sex work had actually pushed that too hard, then the legislation may not have got through. So in a sense, the definition that we have is not conclusive, and it might seem that that umbrella term makes it all conclusive, but it's not. There's just those things I think are probably the most relevant to business. What's in there is most relevant to business rather than being an exhaustive list, if you like. Yeah.
So it's an act that's especially aimed at forcing corporations to basically examine themselves.
Yes, right. So yeah, the legislation we have slavery is illegal under our criminal code in Australia. So that's there, and that's obviously been part of the contention as to why do we need a separate piece of legislation when we have a criminal code that says that slavery is illegal. So it's not the legislation of the Modern Slavery Act is really about companies taking responsibility for what's going on in jurisdictions that they have no authority over.
Right.
and to actually take responsibility for what's going on in terms of the production of those products and the conditions of people working in those contexts, which is complex, as you know, have to work internationally in other jurisdictions and understand the local laws and customs. What may be deemed as exploitation for us is not necessarily exploitation for another. So if we do apply, for example, a human rights definition to, you know, what does it mean to live a dignified life or to work with dignity, that may not be respected or may be interpreted differently by different cultures who may not have a problem with, for example, child labor and you know, in some countries, child labor, that's children working on the farm is just part of life. And yes, it'd be great to send them to school, but that could be deemed as a luxury in our context, because survival, we need to put food on the table. That's the primary concern. So sometimes that's all about needs, and yeah, it could seem that it's a bit of a luxury to have everything as nice and tidy in different parts of the world, because that's what we want.
Extraordinarily complex. And I wanted to ask you about production chains, because in a previous life, I worked for L'Oreal, and at that time, there was a great deal of concern about animal testing in the cosmetics industry. And at that time, L'Oreal's official response was, we contract out our testing. So we can say officially that L'Oreal does no animal testing. What our contractor does is not our business or our concern. And, you know, that's a disingenuous sort of response. And you implied that there's not necessarily a great will among corporations to dig as deep as they need to. But how difficult is it to uncover practices of enslavement in production chains?
Oh, it's very difficult. I mean, that incident, that example there, it continues today. So, for example, you know, we work with companies, and we might identify out of their 100 suppliers that the top 10 at risk are suppliers in Australia. Out of that 10, 6 are reporting entities in Australia, who might then, if we then reached out to those organizations, might say, well, you can just read our modern slavery statement. You can just read our policy. We're not going to fill in a self-assessment questionnaire because we've already filled in 20 of those already this year. The best thing to do would be to read our policy and trust that we're doing the process. That can make life interesting for organizations. So, you know, who think, well, actually, no, I want to know. I want greater visibility, and I want to know that you actually are doing the due diligence. And because there is no pressure to do due diligence at the moment with the Modern Slavery Act, a lot of companies have just arrived at a point where they've got risk management frameworks in place. They've done an initial risk assessment. They've updated their policies, but there's a sticking point then when it comes to working with their suppliers, and there's obviously a range of entities there, and companies and organizations need to think through on that point. Well, who can we actually leverage? Where can we leverage our influence? Because, you know, for example, and this is no criticism to any organization, but you might be a smaller entity, and your biggest suppliers might be Telstra or Optus or Australia Post or Toll or some massive organization that you can't really do much with. There's essentially, you have to take at face value the work that they're doing, unless there's a way in which you can develop a collaborative approach, and that's the approach that we advocate for. A lot more needs to happen in partnerships and collaboration, so that companies it's not a threat to an organization to be asked to do due diligence. Actually, there's an opportunity here to work together to do something. That gets even more complex when you've got a supplier who's based overseas, for example, in the United States. And there's obviously, you know, an example might be with energy. So you might have a massive energy giant in the United States. They are your biggest spend. And they just don't want to talk to you at all. So that makes it difficult. So it's it's easier when you might, for example, have your own relationship with a factory, say in China, that can make it easier, or where you have more influence over, you might have control over a factory in the world, then there's a lot more work that can be done. But yeah, working with different entities who may not care because you represent 0.1% of their client list, then they may not care that you want to do this. So this all comes down to, you know, at one level there's government involvement here. There needs to be an emergence of more legislation. It needs to become more of a, this is what we do, this is business, rather than the exception. This is not exceptional. This is something that is actually normal and part of doing good business. So, but all this takes time.
Yes.
All this takes time, and the complexity is just amounting when it comes to Xinjiang province, for example, and a lot of products are made there. Or might start their life there. The product life might start in Xinjiang province. So getting any clarity, visibility in that part of the world at the moment is almost impossible, if not impossible, in terms of the Chinese government not looking favorably at all upon anyone who wants to come in to verify anything in terms of auditing or social auditing. It's not possible. So
yeah, that's going to keep you busy.
Yes. Well, that's the idea.
So thank you so much for taking this time for us. And you've left your contact details, and we will be discussing the questions and the issues that you've raised in our tutorials in week 1.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I wish you all well in what you're doing. And yeah, happy to talk to people should they have any further questions.